Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to the first LeasePlan webinar for 2021. My name is Gavin Eagle. I'm the Managing Director of LeasePlan International, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all here on behalf of the LeasePlan Group. Today is a very special webinar, and we can see that in the level of interest that we've had and the participation rates as well. We have just on 500 participants on the webinar today from 30 countries or more. In the unprecedented times that we are in at this time, the pandemic has wreaked havoc on society, both at a social and a personal level, as well as a financial and an economic one in equal parts. And that really is the starting point for our webinar today. We are very glad to have our partners, McKinsey, who will be walking alongside us today to give their most recent perspective and thinking on these key themes. So what are the key themes we'll touch? Well, firstly, as we look hopefully towards the end of the pandemic, what will be the macroeconomic outlook for the global economy? And then secondly, and very interestingly and importantly for all of you on the webinar today, how will that impact the overall future of mobility? So I'll now walk over to our McKinsey team, and it's with great pleasure that we have Jens, Stephanie and Esther with us today. And firstly, I'll turn to Jens. So Jens, we were due to be together today, obviously here in Amsterdam. That's unfortunately not been possible due to the tightening restrictions in Germany. So maybe the first question to you is, obviously McKinsey, you're a company that provides support and advice to companies to help them survive, not only survive, but thrive. How complicated is that mission, given the current circumstances we are all living in, where things seem to change day by day?
Yeah, thank you very much, Gavin, for having us. Yeah, indeed. First and foremost, this entire situation is obviously a humanitarian crisis, and I think we should put that first in kind of everything we say about this. But you are obviously indeed right. This has been a challenge for our clients, for McKinsey, but also for our people. Kind of on all levels. Nevertheless, I must also say, at least to me, we were able, and specifically our clients were able to surprisingly quickly kind of pivot to fully virtual models. And we have seen great impact stories over the last couple of months, actually, that were delivered fully virtually. So I think overarchingly, we have been able to deal with this pretty well, but we are certainly looking out towards more physical interaction and more direct interaction, hopefully in the near future.
Terrific. That sounds great. Well, I know there's a lot of anticipation today about the webinar we're having. So if I can hand it back to you, maybe you can introduce the team and then we can get started.
Yes, absolutely. So my name is Jens, as already said. I'm a partner based out of Germany, doing mostly strategy and corporate finance related work. More important, though, for today's topics is the partner colleagues that I have with me today. On the one hand, we have Ezra Greenberg, who is based out of the US and is a partner that has led a lot of our work, macroeconomic work, actually, specifically in direction to the current situation. So looking forward to hear his perspective on specifically the macroeconomic situation. And on the other hand, we have Stephanie Haag, who is one of the core leaders of our McKinsey Center of Future Mobility, and will speak to you in the second part on the future of mobility and the impact of the current situation.
Okay, so if we pass across to Ezra now to give us an overview of the macroeconomic outlook. Me. You've muted yourself. So could I ask you to unmute yourself? My apologies.
Am I muted? I'm sorry.
My apologies, yeah.
Okay. Sorry, let me start again. Good afternoon, or good day, depending on where in the world you are. As was said, my name is Ezra Greenberg. I'm a partner here at McKinsey, based in Stamford, Connecticut, which is about 70 kilometers due east of New York City. I'm happy here to talk with you today about our work on both the virus and the economy. As we always do on the first slide, we always start by going back to where we were more than a year ago at this point, and how we started thinking about the incoming pandemic and what the economic implications would be. And we called that at the time the twin imperatives. And what these imperatives are at the time were safeguarding our lives. As we all remember, we were all scrambling with this pandemic in front of us and the dire consequences it was wreaking, and therefore the need to try and stop the spread as rapidly as possible and safeguard lives. At the same time, we felt quite strongly that we would very rapidly get to the second imperative, which we referred to at the time as safeguarding our livelihoods, which is how are we going to deal with the economic shock? And we have to not only think about the direct health impact, but if we don't think about the economic impacts, the consequences for our families and our friends and our businesses and society could be just as dire. So those are the twin imperatives. They've always been the same. And we've been carrying them through all of our discussions across the crisis. Here's on this page here is just a summary across OECD countries of where we are in the current state of the virus. This may be a little bit different to the way in which you typically see it, but the way the chart is written is that wherever the peak of new testing, new cases, and new deaths reaches, that is normalized to 100, so you can see where we are today relative to what's happened in the past. And the very, very good news is that both mortality, which is the deep blue line, and the new cases on the royal blue line have both come down quite dramatically since the terrible second or third peak, depending on which country you were earlier in the year. But it's important to realize that these are still very, very elevated numbers relative to what would be a normal flu season. Right. So in the U.S., for example, there's still approximately 1,000 deaths per day. When we think about when will it all be over, which is the question that we're all asking, there is this concept which I'm sure you've all heard about, which we call herd immunity. And that is essentially the simple definition that I like to call it is like when you can take your kids out to the movie theater and don't have to worry about masks. So that's really when this is over from a public health perspective. And in the United States and the UK, the recent evidence suggests that this could be still somewhere in the third quarter, although in mainland Europe, it's more likely towards the end of the year, largely because of the availability of vaccines and the slower pace that's been rolling out. But it's really important to not just focus on herd immunity. There is another point, which is sooner, which we call the return to normalcy, which is when we have vaccinated the most vulnerable and mortality rates are down to something which you would consider a normal flu season. At that point, it will become much safer for us to engage in what we consider normal activity. And that's likely going to be somewhere in Q2, beginning-ish of Q2, mid-Q2 for the UK and the US, and probably somewhere more like the end of Q2, early Q3 for Europe. And this is not that we're through it. We'll still be wearing masks, we'll still be doing social distancing, but we will be able to engage more fully with each other. So think about this as a gradient. If you think about what are the factors that will actually influence this, I'm not going to drag you through all the details on the slide, but there's a lot of puts and takes, right? There's the population that's vaccinated, how many courses and secured, supply readiness, natural immunity, et cetera. And so when you think about any particular country, you have to kind of look at all the factors to try and understand what are the risks. I think the best synthesis here is quite simple. Is that we are in a foot race between our ability to vaccinate our populations and the spread of what we call variants of concern. Like there's always new variants of the disease, but there are a few that are very concerning, and we need to keep an eye on that. And because of the variants of concern and what they might mean and the implications for the efficacy of vaccines, there's a lot of downside risk to this, and we could be, another quarter or more past the dates that I said before we would reach these rates, depending on how well we do against that foot race. Okay. So that's the basics on where we are with the virus. There was recently an article published by McKinsey colleagues on McKinsey.com, which gives the current state, which I would recommend you going to look at if you want more details on that part. When we think about the virus and the economy, again, 1 year ago, as we sat down to try to frame this, there were two major things to think about. On the vertical axis, it was all about the virus health impacts. That is, what are the impacts of the spreading virus, and can they be controlled? And on the horizontal axis, it's the effectiveness of economic policy interventions. Now, back in March, back a year ago, we really didn't know whether or not there was going to be an uncontrolled global pandemic, and we didn't know whether or not governments were going to respond in the way that they have with economic policies. So that's why you have this kind of more complicated 9-box matrix with A scenarios and B scenarios. Think about the B scenarios as things which we avoided, which were really pretty terrible outcomes. So the bottom row is an uncontrolled global pandemic, which we avoided. And the left-hand column is really ineffective responses or non-responses by fiscal and monetary authorities. So we've been able to avoid those by and large, which is very good. If you think about the top row, think developed Asia, New Zealand, countries that were able to crush the virus very rapidly and start returning to what would be considered normal economic behavior. And then for the most part, the United States, Europe, most of Latin America, et cetera, are in this middle row. And the question becomes how effective the economic policy response is going to be relative to the virus, which is kind of your A1 world. And how effective and what if the new stimulus is going to come in, which is a world which we call A2. And I'll describe the numbers on those right now.
Ezra, just a quick question that's come in. You talk about policy interventions. If we talk a moment about obviously the recent stimulus bill in the US, and also some of the actions taken obviously by the European Union as a collective. Could you comment on those, and particularly and potentially the impact that they may have on the economy regaining its footing and momentum?
Terrific. Why don't you flip forward 2 slides to what's page 9 in the presentation, please? Yes. So this is a depiction of what's been put in. I kind of call it it's kind of the wall of money slide. And what these columns show you are the different levers that have been pulled by various governments as a percentage of GDP. So if you look at the Eurozone, nearly the support that's gone into the economy through equity injections or loans, direct spending, foregone revenue, quantitative easing by the ECB, as well as lending from the long-term lending authorities from the ECB. If you add all that up, that's nearly 50% of GDP in the last year. Now, it's really important that not each one of these levers has the same impact. So adding this up, it's not strictly additive, right? In the sense that a dollar of this stimulus does a dollar of that stimulus, but just to get a sense of the size of what's been done, it's really unprecedented. And so the good news is that governments have responded with size and with speed. And that gives us the opportunity to not only avoid the worst outcomes on the downside, but also potentially open the door to a much stronger second half recovery. And so if you were to go to the following page, which has, I believe, the Eurozone GDP numbers on it, the question is really, we're in a world of A1 versus A2, okay? And if you believe that the stimulus is sufficient and we're able to get the vaccination campaigns ramped up and rolled out rapidly in Europe, and that raises confidence confidence with consumers and businesses, you could be in a world, that's very close to A2. And as you can see, the median expected annual growth from a survey of 55 institutions by Bloomberg has 2021 growth at 4.2%. If we're more concerned about the headwinds that we're facing,
sorry, one quick question just to come through.
Yes.
If you look at the scenarios for GDP growth, obviously for the European Union, maybe around 5.3%. Obviously, there are going to be some winners and some losers, so to speak, some that are growing faster than others. Could you maybe talk a little bit about that? There seems to be this famous north-south divide in Europe. Maybe you could comment on why it may be that it'll take some economies longer to get going after this pandemic in Europe.
So the north-south divide kind of remains, right? So one of the things that we saw after the financial crisis in Europe was a focus on debt reduction and austerity, if you recall. And one of the impacts of that was countries such as very large economies like Italy and Spain and Portugal, not to mention others, suffered quite dramatically in their ability to recover. And indeed, Spain had just regained 2008 GDP levels, and Italy was still 7% below 2008 when the pandemic hit. So there's some long-term issues that have been lingering. And the question really is, are we going to do the same thing, that is, cut off the stimulus too early or continue to give support to the economies that actually require it? Undoubtedly, you're going to see, as is usual in these recoveries, Germany probably outperforming. But the rate in which, let's say an Italy or a Spain or Portugal or even some small European countries perform is really this time going to be dependent not only not giving up on the stimulus, but getting the virus under control. So if Italy is successful or more successful in terms of bringing the virus under control and getting back to normalcy, its ability to kind of get things moving again will be better than in other economies. So it's not this time as simple as will we have the stimulus. It's necessary conditions. Are we going to make sure we give the financial help required? And then the sufficient condition is getting the virus under control. And we're not through this yet. So we see the light at the end of the tunnel, but we still have a long way to go here, folks. And it's really hard to say how those two things are going to play out given the new variants that I discussed before. Is that helpful?
Very helpful indeed. Maybe we could pivot across to also the United States as well and have a look at the outlook in the US as well.
Yeah, so the outlook in the US the description of it is largely similar, except the probability that you're going to get to this higher path is much larger, is much bigger, and the numbers are larger because of the stimulus that's actually been put into the system and the relative more dynamic nature of the U.S. economy relative to Europe, as has been the case for many, many years. And so, again, the question here for the U.S. is, are we going to actually get vaccinated at the rate which we're capable of doing, and is that going to get the return to normalcy and get the juice going? But probably the most interesting question is on this final slide here on the world view, and we could do this for the UK or the US or Eurozone. The question that we're asking ourselves now is, okay, we believe we're going to get through this, okay? We believe that 2021 is going to be a reasonable year, particularly in the second half, that we're going to ultimately get the virus under control. But the question is, what happens next, right? Do we return to an economy that looks very much like it did pre-COVID, right? Or do we face headwinds that we have not yet foreseen and scarring in the economy because of the shutdowns and the fact that folks have been out of work and just, the long-term effects of these kinds of hits that we just haven't seen yet, which would be a downside? Or is there possible to have an upside? And we asked ourselves this question seriously. Can we, for example, in the United States, generate trend growth of 3% instead of the currently expected 1.7? And can Germany grow at 2% or more, except, versus the long-term growth of about 0.7% that's currently kind of dialed in? And the answer to that question is yes. And it's not as hard as one might think. But what has to happen is that, a lot of folks are using the 1920s, the roaring 20s, as the analogy that's going to happen right now when people start spending again. But I remind everyone that the 20s ended quite poorly, right? So that's not the best analogy that we want. So what we do want is what we call the handoff. And the handoff is from government stimulus to private sector activity in such a way that the consumer spending that comes out of this pent-up demand, drives job creation, investment, training, brings people back into the labor force who have left, and this kind of virtuous cycle that we've seen in the past, which would allow us to actually have a regime change in growth. This will take proactive policies on behalf of governments, but it's really also going to take an incredible effort by businesses to focus on sustainable growth, equitable growth, wages, and honestly tolerating a little bit higher inflation, like 2.5% instead of 1.5%. But if we do those things, it's quite possible that the future could be quite bright. And just for example, to close on examples from the U.S., this is something which happened in the 60s, it happened in the 80s, and it happened in the 90s. So there's real precedent for this, given the historical data that we have. It's more about the choices we make than anything that's kind of dialed in, if you will, from above.
Sure. Ezra, I'm sure, as you can imagine, there are questions on that famous word, inflation. So you get an economy that's a global economy that's growing this fast. Of course, what comes with it? Inflation. I think there's already been indications that some of the central banks would accept inflation rates to maintain at a certain level they probably wouldn't have in the past. What's your view on that?
Well, I think that's exactly right. So sorry if this is going to sound a little wonky central bank-like, but there's two things that are important to central banks. The first and foremost is long-term inflation expectations. And you'll hear the ECB and the Fed and everyone say they're well anchored. What does that mean? It means that people's expectations that inflation will be under control remain reasonable, even if, the second point, you get a transitory increase in inflation because of the increase in demand, right? And so central banks separate those two things. And if for folks who are worried that inflation will spiral out of control, I'll remind you that we know what the recipe is to solve that, and that's raise interest rates, right? This is tried and true, and it's painful, but it works. And central banks will do that if they feel like long-term expectations of inflation come out of control. But in the near term, they're much more worried about what's happening in labor markets. In the US, for example, there's still 10 million people less employed than there were before. There's nearly 20 million people receiving some kind of assistance through kind of pandemic relief. We have the lowest employment to population ratio that we've had in a generation. So there's lots and lots of slack in the economy. And it would be a mistake, in my view, to focus on, potential some near-term transitory price increases when there's long-term capacity in the economy and plenty of ability to deal with it. I would say that a premature focus on inflation would be repeating the same mistake that was made in many countries after the financial crisis, which was focusing on debt too quickly and not on growth.
Fantastic. Maybe just to wrap it up now in terms of maybe some of the key takeaways from a macroeconomic perspective.
Yeah. So listen. I think it's important to continue to be vigilant and watch and make sure, as we like to say in the U.S., the cavalry is coming with the vaccine. Well, when the cavalry is coming, you don't, if you look at the old Western movies with John Wayne, they don't put their rifles down and stop fighting, right? So we need to continue to do all of the public health measures that we've been doing to make sure that we have an opportunity to win this foot race between the variants of concern and our ability to stimulate the economy. And then, once that happens, it's really important that we watch for the signs that, consumers and businesses are confident enough to go out and start spending again as they normally would. This does not come back until the services economy comes back. There's only so many refrigerators we can buy. So it's really, really important to raise the confidence level, and we're watching that very carefully. And we're making sure and watching that the government policymakers are doing too much, if you will, rather than too little, because the consequences of doing too little, are quite dire. So those are the things that we're looking at, and it's the matrix. What's happening with our effectiveness of the control, and are we actually putting in the type of stimulus policy required?
Terrific. I greatly appreciate your time. We're going to pass from the macroeconomic perspective and outlook now across to talk with Stephanie and look at what impact this will now have on the future of mobility. So, Stephanie, I'll pass it across to you.
Perfect. Thank you. So we wanted to share with you the view we're having on the future of mobility in general, and also the changes which happened due to COVID. So if you might show the presentation, we have a quite interesting view, the picture before the first one, where we see actually 4 pictures of Paris, France. Because what is quite interesting is that just looking at these pictures, it seems as if we are on the second tipping point of the mobility industry. The first one you see between the 1900s and the 1920s, where it changes from horses to cars. And within the past couple of roughly 100 years, only more cars have been there, but nothing changed tremendously. However, if you look at how it looked like in 2020, you see that there are no cars at all, only pedestrians and cyclists. We know that Paris is quite innovative in terms of having certain regulations and revolutionizing the urban mobility field. And that this is not a picture which we see globally everywhere. However, it shows clearly that there is something tremendously changing. And what that is, we would like to discuss with you today. So in general, we say there are 3 major structural changes happening in the industry. The first one is about customers. So customers become more local and they prefer digital solutions. And especially the major shift we're seeing is towards sustainability and green mobility. Thus, the customer pull actually asks for trends we see everywhere in terms of shared mobility, focus on customer experience, and green mobility. The second big topic is regulation, which is not the pull from consumers, but rather the push. So cities actually are kind of the major catalysts we're seeing in terms of changing mobility. They have a lot of regulations in place, and most of them targeted not only to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also to reduce the passenger miles traveled, so the number of cars in general. This is because cities suffer from the downturns of too many cars. So not only greenhouse gases, but also noise emission, congestion, etc. We also see currently that the regulation, not only on the urban level, but on the long distance market, is gaining speed. So in the European Union, for example, the Green Deal has been announced with many, many regulations in terms of long distance travel as well. The third disruption we're seeing is on the technology side. So we have the ACEs. A stands for autonomous, C for connected, E for electric, and S for shared mobility. And these trends have been in the industry for quite a while, but they're actually gaining speed. And COVID, as we see later, kind of paused some of the trends for a short time, but it seems as if the speed kind of not only came back to where it were, but that it accelerated actually. Software and electronics is a big enabler in the field of technology disruption. And kind of all these changes actually also leads to some changes in the industry. So there are more and more financial investors coming into the field of mobility because they are fostering mobility disruptors, which influence then the overall industry itself. Therefore, looking at these three trends, currently it's quite a unique moment to shape the mobility. Here, I wanted to quickly show you a customer survey we did during COVID. So what you see there is, on the long run, not too much will change in terms of modes chosen. However, the only thing where we see a tremendous uptake is actually in the field of walking and biking. So there, this type of modal share or mobility will further increase. However, for example, number of private cars, public transport, etc., will stay stable. On the next slide, we also see that in a bit different way. So every line actually is depicting a certain mode chosen, driving, public transport, or micromobility. And what you see is, number one, in summer last year, there was the biggest difference. So many people actually opting for driving because they perceived it as the safest mode of traveling. However, if you look at the numbers in January 2021, and this is mobility data we analyzed, you see that actually the lines are pretty close to each other, similar to what they have been a year ago. However, the second big thing we see here is that the overall demand for mobility has decreased due to COVID lockdowns. When we continue, I would like to go on the topic I mentioned, namely cities as catalysts for mobility disruption. So here we see some announcements cities made. Some of them already have been pre-COVID, but actually every city was trying to use COVID as a momentum to ensure sustainability becomes more sustainable. So installing pop-up bicycle lanes, installing pedestrian zones, etc. However, all the regulations here actually aims at reducing the number of cars in the city and to reduce the actual distance or the mobility demand of people in general. And as I said, this is not only due to environmental reasons in terms of greenhouse gases, but it is also strongly based on noise emission, reducing congestion, etc. So the next slide actually shows how this will look globally. What we did is we modeled in line with different city archetypes across the world and how the modal mix will be, how it used to be in 2018 and how we think it will be in 2030. And what you see is every city is different. Some, for example, rely heavily on cars, other more heavily on shared or public mobility. However, what you can see, the number of cars will decrease and the amount of green modes will increase. Next, we'd like to quickly go onto the effect COVID had on mobility. So in the short term, you see that in the mobility trends, the ACEs, you had this low or a downturn in terms of autonomous, where actually testing was paused and therefore investment slowed down as well. And sharing, mainly due to the safety reason that people deemed sharing cars not or sharing mobility not as safe as being in an own vehicle. However, in the midterm, you see actually an acceleration on most of the trends, autonomous kind of staying rather at the level as it used to be. Yeah. Going next. Or we can pause here, that's fine. No, going next, okay, cool. This is a page which I find really, really interesting. because this is a deep dive on the trend of the electric vehicles. What you see here in the white line are the battery electric vehicles, and at what price, or what is the battery price, and at what price do they actually become cost competitive with mild hybrid electric vehicles, which is the light blue line. And what we see here is that at the cost of $100 per battery, electric vehicles become cost competitive. And especially for you owning fleets, you know that the total cost of ownership concept is quite important. And this slide is saying the total cost of ownership of electric vehicles will drop tremendously. So there are already players in the industry who say they already have battery prices below 100 US dollar, and even without subsidiaries, so even without government support, they can already have cost competitive electric vehicles. What we see,
Stephanie, we have one quick question. Just a quick question. We're talking here about obviously the total cost of ownership. Obviously, we see a material decline in the cost here, and I think everyone's aware of that. Some people are asking, actually, will electric vehicles, in terms of a technology, become obsolete? I mean, in the medium term, will they be obsolete as new technology comes in and will be used and completely replace electric vehicles?
Actually, we don't believe that electric vehicles will become obsolete in the midterm, and there are several reasons to that. So one reason is kind of, if you look at the general goals the world has given itself in terms of climate change, you cannot reach Paris 1.5 degree scenario without electric vehicles. The reason for that is you need to start as soon as possible, and electric vehicles are already in place to start today. Second, the transportation sector didn't contribute as much to the greenhouse gas emission goal of Paris as it used, or as technology changes might have created the perception. And this is due to the fact that actually the mobility volumes, both on transporting people, but also on transporting goods, have risen. And therefore, you need to take as many levers as possible to be in line with Paris 1.5 degree scenario. So electric vehicles, we think, is a big lever to go or to move towards a more sustainable future. And we think it will be there in midterm. However, there are other levers which should be taken. And one lever, for example, is on the efficient structure of the transport. So if you look at cities, 30% of the cars there are about to look for a parking spot. And if you, for example, just optimize the parking situation and make it more intelligent to find parking spots, you reduce the traffic tremendously. Another big lever would be to increase or to have an intelligent loading for trucks, because many trucks, or I guess the average is 50% of the load factor of trucks is 50%. So there is also an opportunity to actually improve the efficiency of transportation in general. And then if you also look at further things, so I'm a strong believer that there will be new forms of technology, such as hydrogen, such as synthetic fuels, especially in the field of shipping or airlines. But coming back to the question in the midterm, I guess EV is one of several pillars to answer the Paris 1.5 degree scenario. And as this is the guiding theme for mobility and fostering mobility disruption as well, I don't think EVs will become obsolete in the midterm.
Okay. That's very clear. This next slide is quite controversial. You're saying that we've hit the peak. Is that correct?
Yes.
We have. Okay.
I'm saying we've hit the peak. So in car sales. But the good news will come later, so no problem here. But this page actually is showing different scenarios we have calculated. the main message is we assume that back in 2017, we've had the peak of light vehicle sales. There is a drop, especially due to COVID, and we have several scenarios. So the scenario with the black line, which is actually leading back to the number we hit in 2017, is mobility transition delayed. This scenario describes that the regulation will slow down, that technology disruptions will also slow down. And what we see currently, also given all the trends on COVID, we don't think that this is realistic. We rather see, as I mentioned, Paris, this is the green line, the 1.5 degree climate scenario. So how many cars do we think will be sold to be in line with the Paris degree scenario, and then scenarios in between. And I guess the main message here is in 2030, we will have approximately 10% less car sales than we used to have in 2017. One aspect maybe to the previous topic on EVs, what I didn't touch upon is that in the European Union, we currently see that the sales price of electric vehicles is approximately the same as for internal combustion engine vehicles. So our assumption is that when the energy costs are lower because battery prices are declining, people will tend more strongly towards electric vehicles. So although the number of cars themselves might decline, there is an increasing demand for a new type of cars, namely electric vehicles. If we go to the next page, maybe.
Maybe just one question. There's one question, Stephanie, on that. We look at, okay, there's a peak in new vehicle sales, which will look to recover after COVID. On the other side, what you have now is a large number of new entrants coming into the market, particularly Chinese, looking obviously to sell principally electric vehicles. So I suppose the question is, if the pie remains the same or a little bit less and you've got more players in the market, something's got to give.
Exactly. And this is, so we see that the competition is increasing actually. And we also see that there are players who are good in certain types of vehicles. And electric vehicles, we see that there is a push from Chinese companies or also American companies to, for example, the European market. However, this does not mean that the value pools themselves will decrease over time. It rather means that you need to diversify, or that one option is to diversify the value pools. So maybe if we go to the last slide, and I can answer the question with this slide as well.
Sure. There's one question just to ask on that last theme.
Okay,
and another one? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it was, of course, you've got the combustion engine on one side, diesel or petrol, and you have electric on the other side. There is, of course, in between the hybrid vehicle. So what do you see happening with the hybrid vehicle in the coming, say, 5 to 10 years?
So the hybrid vehicle for the passenger field will change its meaning versus the hybrid vehicle for the commercial part. So I guess that is something where we need to look at strongly. However, if loading, so if the range of electric vehicles increases strongly, if loading becomes more easy available, then the number of cars will or the hybrid will decrease in general. Another aspect which we should consider here actually is the use of cars. So what we see strongly is that the new ways of working with more working from home or hybrid working modes also in the new normal leads to a new type of fleet management, actually, or it would suggest a new type of fleet management. So when we ask some of our clients and ask on how do you want to make your fleet policy in the future, we see that the type of fleet policy will change tremendously and new modes will be offered on the one side. On the other side, we see for job profiles such as a key account manager who always used to have a car, companies are strongly thinking about giving them a shared car so that they share their vehicle with another person in the company. And kind of if you think of the car will have a higher usage, this is something which needs to be taken into account as well. If you think about, do you have a fully electric vehicle or a hybrid vehicle? Because the loading times, etc., will differ to today's behavioral pattern, of course.
Okay, that's super clear. We're coming actually to the end of the webinar, so maybe quickly to wrap up the last slide.
Yes, happy to. So the last slide actually is kind of showing that it's not as negative as it might have been depicted. This slide is actually showing the value pools. So the light blue is saying it is decreasing. The really strong blue is saying it's an increasing value pool. On the left, you see the classical vehicle operations, and on the right-hand side, you see the mobility solutions. And what you see actually that the revenues remain stable or rather grow in the vehicle field. In the mobility solution field, they grow, especially when it comes to all modes linked to autonomous vehicles. So for taxi, e-hailing, car rental, we think they will decrease. However, for all other modes, we think that they will increase. So even for private vehicles, there is a demand for vehicle sales operations and mobility solutions. So to sum it up, we think the industry has a positive outlook because the market and the revenue potential are taking up. However, you see different growth across and different speed of growth across the markets. So for example, shared mobility is growing way quicker than other types of mobility. So in our opinion, you have a good starting position as many opportunities are available to be used. However, one common theme is about diversification of mobility and mobility mix.
Okay. Thank you very much, Stephanie. Greatly appreciated that overview of the future of mobility. And I know that will have been particular interest to many of the participants today. We've run out of time. So what I would like to do is I would like to thank the team at McKinsey. I would like to thank Jens, Esra and Stephanie for taking the time with us today and updating our clients on not only what's happening from a macroeconomic level, but also what's happening in the future of mobility. I hope all of you enjoyed this webinar today. It will be available on demand afterwards if you would like to see it again or share it with others. But from now here from Amsterdam, on behalf of the McKinsey team and myself, I would like to thank all of you for participating today and look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.